Good. Well, many thanks for attending. Great to see so many people interested in infrastructure after a major snowstorm here in the Northeast that paralyzed a lot of air flights. Great to make it here. My name is Rick Geddes. I'm a professor in the Department of Policy Analysis and Management, PAM, the department, not the cooking spray, at Cornell University, which is in the College of Human Ecology. I'm also a visiting scholar here at the American Enterprise Institute. And about 5.5 years ago, I founded a program, an institute at Cornell called CPIP, the Cornell Program in Infrastructure Policy. And I urge you and invite you to Google CPIP Cornell, and you'll see that information. My bio is online. I wanted to say a few things just about how grateful I am to the American Enterprise Institute for hosting this event, and congratulations on the new buildings. I'm a little worried that the screens to the side are too small because I think we might need a bigger display. But just I guess a personal note, I was here last week in this room, and the President Arthur Brooks was giving his State of the Institute speech, which he gives every year, and announced that he had asked the board of AEI to search for his replacement, which shocked me, standing in the back over this. Didn't this guy just start? And he said, no, he's been doing this for 10 years, and that was always his plan. So it got me thinking a little bit back in terms of leadership transitions and my interaction with AEI. My degree's in economics in 1991 from the University of Chicago, and I was thinking about my dissertation topic, and I was basically a chicken because I really wanted to write on the U.S. Postal Service. And since college, I had been interested in the policies surrounding the U.S. Postal Service. I thought it was an odd entity within the United States, being a state-owned enterprise, and et cetera. But I thought if I wrote a dissertation topic on that, I'd never get a job. So I wrote an electric utility regulation, which got me a job at Fordham University in New York City in the economics department. And after achieving the job, I started to think about writing a couple papers on postal services. So I get a call from this guy named Chris DeMuth. And Chris DeMuth is the president of American Enterprise. And he says, we noticed you wrote a couple papers on postal policy. That's really weird. There's not many people doing that. Would you be willing to help work with AEI and we'll support your research on postal policy? And I said, absolutely. And so this was 1993 or 94. And so a series of papers with AEI support came out over the next years in peer-reviewed journals, policy reports, et cetera, so that it supported my research agenda at a time when the National Science Foundation was not going to support research on postal, the National Institute of Health was not, et cetera. AEI filled that niche, which eventually got me a job at Cornell in 2002. So I couldn't be more grateful for that early support in my career in this area that frankly would never get funded were it not for, groups like AEI, particularly AEI, focused on those sorts of issues. So I want to fix ideas today by starting off with a discussion about our subject matter, and our subject matter is infrastructure. Turns out that the economics profession doesn't have a precise definition of what infrastructure is. So I just jotted down a few ideas of the things in society that we're going to talk about. Includes, everybody thinks of roads, bridges, tunnels, but it also includes freight railroads, passenger railroads, natural gas pipelines, electricity systems, generation, transmission, distribution of electricity, drinking water systems, so we get clean water, wastewater treatment systems, that includes their pumps, plants, and pipes, dams, levees, canals, locks, up where we are in upstate New York, seaports, airports, streetlights, sidewalks, but there's also this whole world of what we call social infrastructure, right? And social infrastructure, are standalone facilities, typically not part of a network, schools, prisons, courthouses, hospitals, police stations, fire stations. I could probably go on, but you get the point. Huge swath of any modern economy today is composed of what we normally think of as infrastructure, and it provides all these basic services. Clean water, lights, heat, justice, right? Education. All these things are critical to society. And we all know, probably, or many people hopefully know in this room, the endemic problems in the United States and many developed as well as developing countries with infrastructure. We know from the American Society of Civil Engineers, a lot of our infrastructure is outdated, worn out, suffers from deferred maintenance, years of deferred maintenance. Technological adoption is sometimes slow. There's inadequate funding for it. There's a series of endemic problems that cross these different critical pieces of infrastructure that provide these public goods. So today I'm very excited about the people that we have to address this issue. Our timing is good. The administration has released its plan for infrastructure reform, and we have Derek Kahn from the administration who is going to make remarks about the administration plan. Derek is Undersecretary for Policy in the U.S. Department of Transportation, and in this role he serves as the principal advisor to the Secretary of Transportation and provides leadership and development of policies for the department, generating proposals and providing advice regarding legislative and regulatory initiatives across all modes. Mr. Kahn also coordinates department's budget development. Before this appointment, he served as general manager for Lyft in Southern California. He's also on the board of Amtrak since 2015 and was confirmed by the United States Senate. Prior to that, he was director of strategy at a Silicon Valley startup and worked in consulting for Bain. Earlier in his career, he was policy advisor to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and chief economist for the Senate Republican Policy Committee. And we're very grateful that you have come. And this event will have two sections to it. First, Undersecretary Kahn is going to make remarks. He and I will chat a little bit about some pressing policy issues raised by the administration's proposal. We'll have some Q&A from you. This Undersecretary has to leave. And then we'll have our other distinguished panelists as the second section. So, Derek, do you want to?
Thank you. Thanks, Rich. It's a pleasure to be here. It's actually, if you are ever bored, you should take a look at some of Rich's papers. They are fascinating papers. Last night I read How Much Vertical Integration, Contractual Choice, and Public-Private Partnerships in the United States. It's a page turner. I won't tell you how it is. I want to also thank AEI for hosting this. I don't know if Arthur's around. We saw him earlier. He's great. If anybody hasn't had a chance, folks should take a look about Arthur's column on ideas and ideas in this town. And it's fitting that we are here today talking about infrastructure because there's a lot of ideas out there and a lot of things written about those ideas. But if you look at those ideas closely, there's actually a lot of similarity and there's a lot of areas of overlap, which actually gives the administration a lot of hope that we will find a bipartisan outcome here where you will have 80-90% of the Congress supportive of a package of reforms that can help advance our infrastructure forward. And so first, I want to start by talking about this debate. If you look at the America's infrastructure problems, there are tons of data, tons of reports that talk about how massive our infrastructure problem is. We all know there's a massive backlog in needed maintenance of existing infrastructure. We know that the capital costs range anywhere from $2 trillion to $4 trillion over the next decade. And we all know the ASCE report card that talks about our nation's infrastructure. And when I look at it closely, two thoughts come to mind. First, infrastructure is really bad. And second, thank God a report card that's worse than my report card from high school. So about 1/4, ASCE finds about 1/4 of our nation's bridges are structurally deficient or in need of improvement. More than 20% of our nation's roads are in poor condition. And if you look, since 1980, vehicle miles traveled has more than doubled, yet vehicle lane miles has only increased by 10%. And so you have this major disconnect of the needs and the demands of our nation's infrastructure, a mismatch with what our infrastructure is currently delivering. Governors and mayors echo this call. They are calling on Congress, on Washington, to create a new vision for infrastructure. And despite the overwhelming agreement on the magnitude of the problem, the reporting and the description on a path forward really isn't clear and precise. If you look at the ideas offered, they're actually pretty similar. And folks may say, this idea doesn't fit this specific problem, or this solution doesn't fit this specific city. And the administration says, we agree with that. What our approach is let's create additional tools in the toolbox and additional resources and additional programs that state and local governments can use. Let's really pass a bill that reflects principles of federalism and allows the owners of the asset to make decisions about the asset. Let's let state and local owners of a resource decide whether to sell it off, whether to charge a user fee, and whether to how to maintain and upgrade it. Our current federal funding models are outdated and inadequate to address the magnitude of our infrastructure needs. For instance, as most everyone here in the room knows, and AASHTO's in the room, so they're going to remind us in 5 minutes, our nation's highway trust fund revenue stream is not currently projected to keep pace with long-term outlays. If anybody knows AASHTO, every time you open a press release, highway trust fund sort of mentioned right at the top. And we here have a tremendous opportunity to address this challenge. We know that the highway trust fund probably expires around 2020 or 2021, that's when it goes insolvent. And we have, in the administration, a commitment to rolling up our sleeves and doing the hard work necessary to create an agreement with Congress, states, cities, and localities to find a long-term solution for this. And that's why we're excited here to talk about the President's Comprehensive Infrastructure Initiative, which the President announced just 40 days ago. The initiative is supported by 12 different cabinet agencies, and since the initiative's release, Secretary Chao and 11 other cabinet members have had numerous hearings and testimonies before Congress. And we've been engaging state and local leaders around the country, as well as thought leaders like Rich and folks on this panel. We believe this is the key to helping the public understand the benefits of infrastructure improvement that come with targeted investment. The goal of the infrastructure initiative is to stimulate at least $1.5 trillion in new infrastructure investment, and that includes a minimum of $200 billion in direct federal funding. And as Rich mentioned, transportation is just one component. The initiative includes drinking and wastewater, energy, broadband, and veterans hospitals as well. And our objective here is to truly fix the problem, not simply put out a press release. So some estimates put our country's backlog at $4 trillion. And we know that there is no single funding source that can bridge this gap. And so the administration is focused on partnering with all sources of funding to address this significant need. For instance, TIFIA, the Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act credit program, is a program managed at DOT and has a proven track record. Every dollar that TIFIA is appropriated leverages up to $40 in total public and private infrastructure investment. And so if we gave TIFIA $100, they would be able to lever that up to $4,000. Making smarter investments with limited federal dollars is what our initiative hopes to achieve. And folks like Richard and Kevin have written much about things called P3s, and there's been a lot written about P3s. The President's plan encourages the private sector, where appropriate, to help in the building of our public infrastructure. The P3 approach is increasingly becoming an industry standard in infrastructure delivery around the world for specific projects in specific circumstances. We support this very much. For instance, the $2.4 billion Purple Line project in Maryland, which the Department approved last year, was used by federal grants, a TIFIA loan, in addition to 25% in upfront local and private funding. Similarly, the I-66 project in Virginia received meaningful private investment as well as a TIFIA loan. And Kevin DeGood, who's on the second panel, has written a lot about P3s and in a lot of ways the problems with P3s. The administration very much agrees that P3s are not a panacea. They're not a magic bullet. I think in your paper you said that they're not a silver bullet. And we very much agree that it's specific instances where you could forecast future cash flows, where you can understand costs, where you can project life cycle cost management over the lifetime of a project. Maybe that's when you want to bring in the private sector to transfer risk more efficiently. We know that not all states in the U.S. are able to pursue P3 project delivery because they lack fully enabling legislation at the state level. And our view is this should end. Even the vast majority of states that have passed enabling legislation, the legislation still grants authority to state DOTs. What that means is cities, counties, and local jurisdictions often are not able to take advantage of this procurement method. So the President's infrastructure initiative has rightly focused on federal solutions. At the same time, a key part of the overall solution is also to address needed reforms at the state and local level to fully enable best practices. The administration is working with Congress on other innovative funding solutions, and so everything's on the table. I want to talk about two quick things before we transition over to Q&A 1 is what we are already doing, and 2, where we go from here. The President's already using tools available to the executive branch to speed project delivery, but the administration can only go so far with executive action. Secretary Chow has driven the department to address many of the statutory redundancies and inefficiencies that add time, cost, and uncertainty to the process of permitting. For instance, in America, the average highway project takes 7 years to achieve a record of decision. So for 7 years, we are waiting for a project to move forward. Streamlining the environmental review and permitting process is just one of the most important and impactful ways we can make to move projects forward. An example of this, and I love sashimi, is in the debate of salmon versus trout. If people are confused with what I'm talking about, so was I when I started at the Department of Transportation. If you're trying to build a water project in America, in the Northeast, there's a team of 5 biologists working via the National Marine Fisheries Service on an assessment of the impact to salmon. Yet 6 months later, those same biologists will be doing an assessment on the impact of trout for the same project, but for a different agency. In this case, the Fish and Wildlife Service. And so I don't know if there's some interfish warfare between the National Marine Fisheries Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service, but 2 fish, same project, same people doing it. A common sense reform would be to have both personnel not have these overlapping statutory requirements, but rather share information with each other and create a rationalized permitting timeline. The President's Infrastructure Initiative seeks to eliminate these types of redundant and unnecessary reviews, concurrences, and approvals. Giving agencies firm deadlines to complete their reviews and make decisions, and really holding them accountable for meeting deadlines, is critical to accelerating project delivery. We're already doing this at DOT, specifically with our TIGER program, the Transportation Investment Generating Economic Recovery Program, and the INFRA program, the Infrastructure for Rebuilding America program. Under the INFRA program, states and localities that secure some funding and financing of their own are given higher priority access to federal funds. In addition, INFRA also reserves at least 25% of its funding to be awarded to rural projects. And the most recent TIGER awards saw a record number of awards to projects supporting rural outcomes. And I'm pleased to say that communities have responded positively by modifying their proposals to reflect higher leverage and increased spend on rural and innovative technologies. We're also implementing the President's One Federal Decision mandate, which will help speed the delivery of new infrastructure and reduce costs. The new process is designed to more effectively and efficiently handle the permitting of complicated multi-agency projects to meet the President's new timeline while preserving environmental protections. In addition to permitting reform, the department is doing its part to help grow the economy and create jobs through an aggressive regulatory reform agenda. Costs associated with new U.S. DOT regulations decreased by $300 million in 2017, and we're on track to decrease these costs by $500 million in 2018. So the department is on pace to save taxpayers nearly $800 million in regulatory burdens in 2017 and 2018 alone. And so while the administration is making real progress on implementing needed reforms, we see this set of principles as an overture and a broader conversation with Congress and our stakeholders. This is not the finality, but the beginning. We hope that at the end, there will be a bipartisan process that will harmonize the federal family and give the American people an infrastructure process they deserve, not simply one they've just learned to accept over the years. Thank you very much. Happy to take any questions.
Anyway, so I'm just going to take as the organizer's prerogative to ask one question, and then we'll go to the questions that I'm sure many of you have for Undersecretary Khan. So we hear a lot about infrastructure, the infrastructure gap, right? The infrastructure gap. And I always tell my students there's actually 2 infrastructure gaps, and it's critical to separate them. One is the infrastructure funding gap, and that refers to the underlying dollars that have to come from somewhere to pay for the infrastructure. And then I say, there's two buckets for the funding gap. One is some type of user fee. You charge directly per unit of use for the infrastructure. State of Oregon, my hero, doing mileage-based user fees for the road, get away from per gallon and cents per gallon diesel and gasoline taxes so that your payment for the road is separate from the fuel that you use in your car. And that would be a user fee. Other states are doing, like state of Virginia, I think, is a dedicated sales tax, not really correlated to use of the road. So, that's funding. And then the other one is financing, right? Which is sort of once the funding is in place, what financing mechanisms do you use to pay for all this really expensive stuff? Whether you're designing and constructing something new, renovating something old, it costs a lot of money. And we're lucky in this country that we have really developed financial markets like tax-exempt muni bonds, taxable corporate debt, TIFIA loans, equity, right, on and on. So I guess my question to you is, I view the main problem as a funding gap. The underlying dollars, state, local, or federal level to pay for it, and that once the funding is in place, the financing will move in. The banks and others will talk to you, right? So can you tell us what the plan will do to help address the funding gap that the nation faces across sectors?
Sure, both are definitely, we view as both as significant problems. And we think of funding and financing as stock versus flow. It's a little easier to talk about financing, and let me knock that out. Financing also needs some updating because financing is an easier way to, A, allocate resources, the limited funds, wisely, and two, to transfer risk and allocate risk wisely. And so financing is important. Our bill does a lot in terms of encouraging states to look at innovative ways to deliver projects, which is really a way to enhance how financing works. On the funding side, and that's by far the bigger problem, the $4 trillion, $2 trillion gap, that's how do you generate those funds? We see a number of ways of doing that. One, maybe it's helpful to take a step back. When you think of transportation by definition is a classic public policy problem. You have many people that benefit slightly, but significant costs that are very concentrated. And so you have this free rider problem. All of us in this room benefits if a road is built on the other side of Virginia. But if you received a bill that said, hey, we're building a road in Charlottesville, you'd say, wait, why am I paying for a road in Charlottesville? And so this is a core problem because none of us are encouraged, incentivized, feel comfortable paying for a road in which we don't feel the benefits directly, even though we benefit indirectly in many ways. States and local governments, in our view, are best positioned to tackle this because they are able to identify how do they generate those funds. Perhaps there are assets in their state, in their city that aren't needed, and they should sell those assets. Or perhaps they want to initiate a broad-based user fee, like Los Angeles has done, which is creating, I think, a sales excise tax in the entire county, taking those funds and dedicating it to infrastructure. Our view here is what we need to do is allow states to have tools and incentives to make these difficult decisions to solve this policy problem. And so $100 billion of the $200 billion goes to a program called the Infrastructure Incentives Program. Let's create incentives to encourage state and local governments to enact legislation to make these difficult decisions to generate the funding needed to spend on infrastructure projects. And so what our plan does is it gives you a state or local government 20% of all of the funds they've raised. And so if they pass an excise tax that will generate $10 billion over 30 years, next year we will give them a check for $2 billion. Mm-hmm. That seems to be a pretty significant inducement, not only in the funding amount, but also the timing. Mm-hmm. That if you're going to make a difficult investment decision, but on the front end you're going to get 20% in the first period, states and governments may be incentivized to act quickly. And so we believe that these types of incentives will unlock additional capital, will encourage state and local governments to make difficult decisions, as well as all of the capital that we know are in this country in pension funds, insurance companies, and endowments.
Okay. Just a tiny follow-up question.
Yeah.
20%, is that based on Australia's asset recycling program where their percentage was 15%?
There's no magic to 20%. The question is, if you do it too high, then you don't lever up. You do it too low, it's not an incentive. And so 20%.
So there's an optimum there.
Exactly.
Right. Okay.
And so we are very much, like I mentioned earlier, we're open to all ideas. And so folks have different perspectives as to what the percentage should be or how do we incentivize additional infrastructure funding, we're very open to all ideas.
Great, great. So let's, wow. Dan, we'll start with Dan. Wait for the mic, Dan.
One of my big issues over years of my career has been we talk about the condition of our infrastructure, but we rarely do anything to incentivize anyone at the public, private, or federal, state, and local levels. We had GASB 34 that was supposed to measure the condition of our assets, but that turned into a depreciation process. I did some research and I found that the first public organization to deal with institutionalizing asset management or preservation or renewal was Augustus Caesar back a few years ago, where the aqueducts in Rome were falling apart and he needed some way to put them back into shape. I'm wondering what's in the current bill which incentivizes either government and or the private sector to take stewardship responsibility not only for what we build, but what we have, instead of having a report card that focuses on its condition, focuses on what are we doing to keep it in a state of good repair. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. That's a great question. And we have thought about that a lot. The infrastructure incentives proposal includes 6 criteria that state and local governments apply for this funding competitively. The biggest criteria is leverage. So if they bring resources to the table through either asset recycling or through new revenues, they score better. But another important criteria is life cycle cost management. And so if they weave in how well the maintenance cost over the life of an asset looks like and their plan for addressing it, then they score better and they are eligible for additional funding. We completely agree. There absolutely needs to be a better way of factoring in life cycle costs because there's no incentive to doing it. There's actually no incentive also of thinking through assets that are no longer used. And so that's another area in which we believe the incentives title addresses. If a city or a state chooses to divest of existing assets or put those assets into a long-term lease, that also is either putting to bed assets that aren't used, and so you don't need to spend money maintaining it, and rather liquidating it from the balance sheet of a state or city government. So we believe in 2 ways. We, A, explicitly ask for life cycle cost management, and 2, create an incentive for municipalities to divest of existing assets, to recycle their assets.
Good. This gentleman right here in the nice blue suit, I want one of those. Get rid of this one. Tell me where you got it.
Not a personal shopper, but under Secretary Khan, my name is Daniel Flores. I'm Vice President of the Greater Washington Board of Trade here in this region, and also one of the initial organizations that started the Metro Now Coalition. The PREA funding under the Trump administration, the money was taken out first and then put back in at $120 million, and it's about to end as well. We have been working steadily with the 2 general sessions in Maryland and Virginia and the Council of the District of Columbia to get $500 million of dedicated funding. What is the administration looking to do in order for them to extend PREA funding at 150 or higher to step up to the plate with the region of Maryland, DC, and Virginia, since 40%, if not more, of the users are federal government employees? Thank you.
This, we look at the situation with WMATA and the DC metropolitan area similar to a lot of local transit projects, that the federal government alone can't bear the cost of maintaining and the capital expenditures of all of the metro systems around the country, and frankly all the transportation systems around the country. And so it goes back to Rich's earlier question of how do we fund all these things. The president's budget did reduce funding for Washington Metro, for WMATA. And it was an attempt to say, yes, there are a lot of programs that we have that if we just keep shoveling money, it's never going to create a shift in mindset and a shift in sort of how we think about it. And so the Infrastructure Incentives Program, which was half of our proposal, says let's value criteria that we over-index. For instance, you have the Purple Line and MBTA in Boston that actually have created very innovative ways of attracting new funding, and not simply coming to the federal government saying we want a bigger loan, we need a bigger grant, we just need more funds, but rather this is how the local authorities are stepping up to the plate, and they ask that the federal government help close the gap. And I think that's sort of what we're looking for, that as cities and states on their own identify additional sources of revenue, identify additional ways to close the funding gap, we're ready to partner with them. But I think there's a desire to move away from letting the loudest county or the loudest municipality in the room receive the bulk of either the capital investment grant or the state of good repair funds. Rather, let's change the way infrastructure is delivered and talk about how we can identify new and innovative funding streams.
I think the Undersecretary has time for one more question. If you could stay seated while the Undersecretary leaves, we'll go there. So, sir, right there, in the gray suit.
Undersecretary Khan, Alan Pizarski.
Use the mic, sir.
Thank you. Alan Pizarski. I think that we all looked at the proposals and found in many cases absolutely ingenious approaches to funding and to stimulating, matching funding with funding, for instance, and emphasis on the states. One of the concerns that I saw coming out of it was in the transition we talked a lot about the national interest and recognizing the federal responsibility and the strategic sense, whether it's military or international competitiveness or simply national competitiveness and economic development. So I guess the question is, at what stage does the federal government begin to look at the system with a heavy emphasis on locals to say, is it an adequate national system? Does 50 good highway systems add up to one good national system? We've had that debate for 30 years. But I'm hoping to see that kind of guidance where you, in effect, say, I'm sorry, you can't do it that way because the national interest is this.
This is what we are attempting to do through our infrastructure initiative. And Alan, it's a great observation. I think for years we've had the federal government start laying on top of rule after rule additional constraints of what a national system should look like. And so as a result, you have just tons of federal requirements for states that really have very few dollars. And so we have rules that apply to 100% of highways, yet highways gets 20, 30% paid for by the U.S., by the federal government. And so what we're hoping for through this entire debate is let's have a discussion about this. Is there a piece of the national infrastructure that the federal government should fund and let the rest be decided by the state and local government? Or should we say, because we gave you 10 cents on every dollar, we should therefore tell you how to build it, when to run the test, when your record of decision should be done, all of these onerous rules. And our sense is that doesn't seem to make any sense. And that's the principles we put out last month, and that's the discussion we wish to have. And so our ask to all of you, because everybody in this room, recognizing sort of half the folks here have a number of different ideas and come from a broad set of constituencies, and we very much welcome all of these ideas. I think your panel is great because it covers a wide range of political views. But at the core, everybody agrees our infrastructure is broken, and we all need to fix it with a broad set of solutions. And frankly, at the end of the day, the answer is probably all of the above, especially the Highway Trust Fund, John.
Good. Well, let's thank the Undersecretary for making a trip out. Yeah. Thank you very much. So I'm just going to very quickly introduce our distinguished panelists here, and if we read through their entire bios, it would take the rest of the afternoon, so we don't want to do that. But I couldn't be more excited to have the quality and perspectives, experience of the panelists we have today. And I'll just start closest to me is Matt Rose, who is Executive Chairman of BNSF Rail. And he previously served as 13 years as its CEO and 11 years as Chairman. He was made President Chief Operating Officer in 1999 after having served as Senior Vice President Chief Operations Officer. Prior to that, he was in the trucking industry. Matt is now doing a ton of board service. He's on the Board of Trustees of Texas Christian University, also an AEI board member. He's on the board of AT&T, maybe you've heard of them. He's also on the board of and chairman of Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, on the board of Fluor Corporation, American Association of Railroads, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Business Roundtable, Business Council, and Boy Scouts of America. Matt and I, by the way, served together over 10 years ago on a commission created in the 2005 Safety Lou Highway Reauthorization Bill called the National Surface Transportation Policy and Revenue Study Commission. And Matt was CEO of BNSF at that time and made terrific presentations to the board, and I learned a ton about how railroads operate from Matt. So it's great to have Matt in this capacity. Next is Jung Lee, who leads AASHTO's policy efforts across all transportation modes. He works with Congress, executive branch agencies, transportation industry stakeholders, and Jung represents policy interests of state departments of transportation as bills and regulations are developed and implemented. He also oversees AASHTO's technical capacity building programs in the areas of the environment, finance, planning, transit, and rail. Jung began his career with the Federal Highway Administration in 2000 and joined AASHTO in 2007. He's founder of the Young Professionals in Transportation and former chair of Road Gang, which I've spoken to as a DC-based. Jung also serves on my board of the CPIP program. Thank you, Jung, for your efforts to help Cornell become an academic center in these studies. And he was one of our original board members for the CPIP program, which has been terrific. Next is Bob Poole, who I've known for many years as well as Director of Transportation Policy and the Cyril Freedom Trust Transportation Fellow at Reason. He has advised the U.S. Department of Transportation and half a dozen state departments of transportation. He's helped introduce a number of policy ideas into U.S. transportation, was a long-term toll concessions, a lot about tolling, P3s, etc. Bob produces Reason's monthly e-newsletter, which you should read, called Surface Transportation Innovations, which I enjoy reading each time it comes out. And recently, Bob has what I consider to be the definitive book in this that is coming out by my alma mater's press, the University of Chicago Press, 2018, available on Amazon, called Rethinking America's Highways, a 21st Century Vision for Better Infrastructure. This is going to be my textbook for my fall class at Cornell. Bob received a bachelor's and MS in mechanical engineering from MIT and undertook graduate work in operations research at New York University. And Kevin has joined us. Kevin and I recently met. Kevin gave me a very brief bio, but Kevin DeGood is Director of Infrastructure Policy at Center for American Progress. Before joining CAP, he served as Deputy Policy Director at Transportation for America. He holds a master's degree in public policy from the University of Southern California, and I understand attended UNC Chapel Hill for his undergrad. You have to give credit to your professors, Kevin. But anyway, so what we're going to do is I'm going to ask each panelist to comment a little bit on the administration's proposal, just briefly, and then we'll do a little bit of Q&A amongst us, and then we'll go to the audience. So Matt, we'll just go right down the...
Great. Well, I want to start by going back 10 years ago when Rick and I served on this commission together. And at that point in time, we came out with a number of different proposals. One of them was really heavy around permit reform. And I think the administration's proposal takes what was in the FAST Act to the next level. I believe that permit reform is really one of the key issues in terms of our national infrastructure, because you can have all the money in the world. If you can't get a permit, then you'll never build it. And while the federal government has some unique ability to improve federal permit reform, it's really the local and the state and the federal government that has to work together. There's other countries, our friends to the north have figured this out. They do concurrent permit reform. They do time clocks. They have the same rigor around environmental standards. So it's really important what was started in the FAST Act and what I think needs to happen in the next FAST Act 2, if you will, in terms of permit reform. The other thing that we came up with in the commission report, we did the needs analysis and we fast forwarded this thing's going to look like the next 50 years. From the railroad standpoint, we haul freight and passengers, but primarily freight, and we see what's happening in our supply chains. Just this general, what I call the general slow, deadly slowdown of what will happen out there on the nation's highways, intermodal connectors, ports, railroads, things like that. So most of our big infrastructure was built in this country when we had, specifically for the highway systems in the 60s, we had 200 million people, railroads even less than that. And population growth just continues to load up these various infrastructures. We now have 318 million people in this country. And even though we've seen some changes in driving habits, one thing about population growth, which we all believe we're going to continue to grow, it just continues to consume more and more freight for every person living in this country. And so if we don't think about how we do things significantly different in the future, it's going to get worse. It gets worse over time. And I always describe infrastructure and the quality of our infrastructure and the efficiency of our infrastructure as a weapon of mass competitiveness. And I don't think we've done a good job of trying to sell the American public and our officials on why it is so important. But if you're a worker in the middle part of the United States, and if we have an incredibly efficient supply chain, then you are more competitive worldwide. As that supply chain starts to slow down and consume more resources and can become more expensive, everything that we produce in this country becomes less competitive. It will come from alternative supply chains. And we see this in every business line. We look at 22 businesses in the railroad, and we see this all over the place. The last piece of the commission report was we talked about the fuel tax. And we identified that the fuel tax would have to change. And we recommended that over a 20-year period that we would start to migrate off to something else. Rick and I and Amy Hawkins, we were having breakfast this morning, and I said, there's really two things that I think we got wrong in the commission report. One is that we didn't know how fast we would continue to move away from the user pay system, which we are. The FAST Act was incredibly creative in terms of how they funded it. But the other thing, I don't think we had any idea 10 years ago how far along we would be in terms of changing away from the gasoline engine. And that is only going to put a lot more pressure on our revenue that goes in the Highway Trust Fund. So I think this thing is going to get worse quicker than what we would have achieved, what we would have thought when we were putting together this report 10 years ago. Thank you.
Great. John? Sure. Thanks so much, Rick, for having me on this panel, and look forward to a great conversation to follow. So I'll just start by saying that, when you ask most little kids, ask them what do they want to become when they grow up, they'll say, astronaut, president, sports athlete, or whatever. Personally, I wanted to work for the Federal Highway Administration. It's a little weird. I was building sand highway castles, or sand highway interchanges rather than sand castles when I was a little kid. So I get that it's not normal to think about infrastructure for most normal people. And I think that's where just having this conversation being laid down by the President of the United States to put healthcare reform, tax reform, usually, it's jobs, economy, those kinds of things. Infrastructure doesn't make it to the top of the national conversation. So I think we do have a very unique window of opportunity to really talk about the stuff that doesn't normally get talked about. Of course, we have a long way to go, and from the state DOT's perspective, the administration's proposal is the conversation starter. And we recognize that from what Undersecretary Khan just said, the federal government is really trying to maximize as much infrastructure development with as little direct federal dollars as possible, which I think makes sense from the federal government's perspective. But what does that mean for the country as a whole? Because from the state DOT's perspective, we believe that the administration's plan is relying too much on these discretionary grants, where the federal agencies directly pick how to fund projects. What the states really need more of is the form of formula transportation dollars, because state and local governments already have 20-year long-range plans. They have 4-year capital program documents that identify these are the priorities in our state, in our metropolitan area, based on public input. But what we're hearing from the administration is, look, the state and local governments need to step up more of their own taxes, their user fees. 31 states since 2012 have already done that exact action by taking the hard political step to raise transportation revenues. Yet at the same time, we haven't adjusted the federal gas tax and diesel tax in 25 years. Now, that being said, we really do appreciate the need to look at regulatory reform when it comes to environmental permitting and review. There's been a lot of improvements made under the National Environmental Policy Act, the NEPA process. A lot of states, we have about 6 now, taking direct responsibility to carry out the traditional federal requirements on that to speed it up, but still be held accountable to meet the same rigorous requirements, make sure that the environment is protected. I think there's opportunity to modernize the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act to the same degree that we've done on NEPA. Now, so at the end of the day, as Derek mentioned, it really comes back to the Highway Trust Fund. The fact of the matter is that we're looking at a cliff. In 2021, federal highway funding is going to be cut by 40% based on current cash flow projections. Federal transit funding out of the trust fund will be zeroed out for 3 years starting in 2021. That is an unacceptable outcome. It's a big hole to fill. We recognize that to do, say, a 6-year bill to follow the FAST Act, we'll need $117 billion just to stay at the current funding levels adjusted for inflation. But, we are, again, starting this important and much needed and long overdue conversation on infrastructure, and look forward to working with the administration and Congress and everybody else represented not only on this panel, but also everyone in the room as well, to actually get something meaningful and substantive done this calendar year. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Bob.
Well, I'm enthusiastic about what the administration has produced, not for the usual reasons, but I think because it's raising fundamental questions about what is the federal role as opposed to the role of state and local governments. I think we have the fact that we have the situation that John just described looming ahead of us, the fact that we have massive deferred maintenance problems that go on from decade to decade in our infrastructure, that we have chronic congestion on our highways that gets worse rather than better. I think there's some very fundamental institutional problems that need to be addressed. And I think that what the administration has proposed, I think, is a starting point. At least it says we should have the conversation about the relative roles and about the institutions. And so that's one reason why I think it opens the door to a conversation that's long overdue and that we really need to have. I think the idea of bringing in private capital, which is stressed, it's the sub-theme, really, of the whole incentives initiative. As Secretary Khan alluded to, that is critically important. The kind of long-term P3 projects that we have on a small scale, and Virginia right here in the capital area is a good example, have some fundamental institutional differences from standard infrastructure projects. Because they have long-term stewardship relationship involved, the projects are financed, designed, built, operated, and maintained by a single institution. This is very similar to how we do a lot of other essentially public utilities, railroads, electric utilities. One entity has the stewardship responsibility from start to finish over a long period of time. We don't really do most highways that way. Toll roads, to a limited extent, yes, that's the closest we come to that model in the highway sector. But most of our highways are not, they don't have the right institutions in place for proper stewardship. And I think that, again, we've got a conversation that's been opened by the administration's plan to start looking at that. And if we can actually use that the incentives initiative to stimulate more states to have workable P3 legislation and tap into some of the over $400 billion that's sitting in infrastructure investment funds, wanting very much to invest more in the United States as opposed to Argentina and the Czech Republic and so forth, but there's not enough projects. I think we can stimulate more projects along these lines. We can see some of these institutional changes and why that will be a better model for major highway projects, for mega projects in particular. Finally, I think the potential of leveraging, which he mentioned also in his opening remarks, is very critically important to understand. Those of us who've been familiar with the TIFIA program and with private activity bonds and how these P3 projects are financed see that there's really leverage here from the federal government standpoint. The federal government has only been investing directly in the TIFIA loans. They've authorized tax-exempt private activity bonds, but those are issued by a state entity on behalf of a P3 company. So the leverage, it's at least 40 to 1, as he mentioned. A calculation in Eno Transportation Weekly recently said 57 to 1. So somewhere in that ballpark, that's very, very powerful, and those dollars can go a long way, not only in financing, but in stimulating a better institutional model of stewardship. And that, I think, is really important.
Thanks, Bob. So Kevin, likes and dislikes about that.
Sure. I think it's important to place this administrative proposal in context. It's talked about as though it's a national plan for infrastructure investment, and I don't really think that's an honest way to see it. Let's think about the plan in relationship to the budget. If we look at the president's most recent budget, which is equally a statement of political intent and interest, we see that the president calls for cutting existing federal infrastructure programs by about $280 billion. The plan, which we've been talking about so far today, only calls for $200 billion worth of total federal expenditures. So that's a cut of about $1.40 for every $1 of proposed new expenditure. That's not a national plan for infrastructure investment. And we know that because we can compare it to past historical examples. So if we look at how much money the federal government spent on interstate construction and, I guess, highway construction and maintenance generally in 1955, and we compare that to 1970, which was the peak of the interstate construction period, and we inflate those 1955 dollars, so we're comparing them in real terms, right? The federal government increased its total spending on highways by 543%. That's what it means when the federal government sets a goal, has a vision, and puts money towards that goal. What this plan does is want all of the political credit for saying that there's a national plan for infrastructure investment, when really just turning around and telling governors and mayors, good luck, fellas, go ahead and raise the money on your own. And you have to ask yourself, if the incentives program, which provides at best 20 cents on the dollar, and I would note, that's not 20% of the total project cost. It's 20% of new money in that application to the federal government. So it's not even clear that you're going to get 20% of your total project. But how many people here would want to go to work next week and work 80% harder for a 20% raise? I don't think there's very many of us in the room. I don't think there are very many governors and mayors and county executives who want to go out and undertake the incredible political lift that raising revenues involves when the federal government is going to come with so few dollars to the table. So I think there's a lot of magical thinking about how much the incentives grant program is actually going to stimulate. Let's move on to financing, because there's also been a lot of talk about financing and leverage. I think it's important to put that in context too. State and local governments do not lack ways to borrow money. What they lack are revenues to repay those new sources of project debts. If we look at MAP 21, two surface transportation bills ago, dramatically expanded the TIFIA loan program at the U.S. Department of Transportation. And most of that loan volume was not sucked up by state and local project sponsors. It was left on the table because state and local governments don't lack access to project financing. The municipal bond market today has about $3.9 trillion of outstanding municipal issuances. Now, not all of those are for infrastructure, but what that tells us is that there is a very active, very robust municipal bond market, that if you show up with a project and your project has a pulse, meaning revenue, somebody is going to lend you money, right? Now, you might come to the federal government TIFIA loan program because if you have a just barely investment grade credit rating, the federal government's debt is cheaper than municipal debt. The federal government's debt is more flexible. It allows backloading instead of levelized amortization like a municipal bond. There are differences between municipal debt and TIFIA loans that can be attractive depending on the characteristics of your project. But let's also remember that in the absence of the TIFIA loan program, many of those projects would still be built, right? Because the municipal bond market is so robust. So we should keep in mind that it's not a question of financing, it's a question of funding. We also need to keep in mind what is the bulk of the need. It is absolutely the case that we face a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure deficit, right? But when we talk about leveraging, we talk about financing, we talk about P3s, we should recognize that we're talking about an incredibly small sliver of the total projects out there that are to be done. An example, I went and I pulled the Ohio Department of Transportation's Surface Transportation Improvement Program, which has about 1,650 projects that the Ohio Department of Transportation intends to complete in the next 5 years. The average cost of those projects is about $12 million. The average cost of a public-private partnership that has received an equity contribution and a TIFIA loan since the TIFIA program was created is about $1.2 billion, right? So those projects are very important, and they tend to be the ones that are very interesting to discuss, but they're not actually the bulk of what is needed. And those projects, the kinds of projects that are in the ODOT STIP, are not the kind of projects that have any interest from private capital markets, right? Like, they just don't. That's not the kind of stuff that you're going to spend millions or tens of millions of dollars in staff time scrubbing a deal to go out and do a project that has a total price tag of $12 million. So there's an incredible mismatch between what is the need and what is the reality on the ground and what this plan is. Okay, so what would be a better vision? To our minds at the Center for American Progress, a better vision for infrastructure would have 5 characteristics. The plan would need to be robust, comprehensive, equitable, sustainable, and targeted. What do I mean by that quickly? Robust. It should have $1 trillion in direct federal expenditures in the coming 10 years. It should be comprehensive, meaning it shouldn't just be about surface transportation. It should cover a wide range of infrastructure needs, including things like school reconstruction, low-income affordable housing, transportation, multi-modes, drinking water, wastewater, so on. Equitable. To the greatest extent possible, it should be about increasing access to opportunity and redressing historical harms from past investments. You have only to look at the federal highway program of the 1960s and 70s to see that we did a lot of damage, and there are a lot of communities that are still suffering from where we put those facilities today. Sustainable. These investments need to help the United States of America, among other things, meet its global CO2 commitments. And finally, to the greatest extent practicable, we need to have those resources be targeted to the communities that are facing the greatest economic hardship and have the greatest infrastructure needs. And if you're looking at what the Trump plan is and you're thinking about those 5 characteristics, you'll see that the Trump plan in no way achieves any of those goals.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. I'm going to actually leave her, I'll take the first question, leave her off of Kevin's point, because I think, this is getting at the distinction between funding and financing, which has bedeviled this debate for the last decade that I've been studying it. As an economist, I have to say that, as I think about funding, where does the money come from to pay for things, right? In markets where we have a variable per unit charge, right? Things work pretty well, right? So I can look at the stuff in front of me. There's a variable per unit charge for water. There's one for pens. There's one for my pop socket, one for the phone, one for the mic, one for the pet. These markets are they perfect? No, right? There's problems, but they work reasonably well. And now Matt's Railroad is a variable per unit price for shippers. I don't know exactly how you charge your shippers, but I think you've probably thought. And the freight rail industry works pretty well. Is it perfect? No, right? There's some problems. So you can go industry by industry and say in industries where prices are transparent and variable, they cover the cost of supply. That works pretty well, right? And the problem that I see with highways and a lot of infrastructure is that we don't have that, right? So the gas tax, as Matt said, the gas and diesel taxes the revenue is declining faster than predicted because people are adopting electric vehicles. Both the end of the George W. Bush administration increased CAFE standards, One of the first things President Obama did was increase those standards further. The engineers responded by making engines much more fuel efficient, but that really hurts the revenue into the Federal Highway Trust Fund at both the state and local levels. So what I would suggest, and I don't know if Kevin or Matt or anybody wants to respond to it, should policy be pushing more in the direction of what some states, and again, Oregon is the leader, but California is moving in this direction, of a mileage-based user fee, but making it variable, like, any other market that we see. And, as an economist, I would love to see policy pushing in that direction, assisting states, education, whatever it takes. I'd just be curious, Matt, this goes back, by the way, to 10 years ago when we were on the commission, and Matt heard me make these same arguments to other commissioners. I'd be curious. We'll start with Matt and then go to anybody else.
Yeah, so I think there's two issues. One is the broader concept of a user pay system. When we move away from that, which we already have, we've moved away from a user pay system in most part, then we lose perspective of how we're going to pay for this. And we come up with tremendously creative ways to do it, like tax the Federal Reserve, right? What does that have to do with infrastructure? But that's where, it's like, why do you rob the banks? That's where the money was. So they went and got the money. So that's one point. The second point is that we wear out the highways the same way we wear out the railroads. Weight and distance. It's very simple. It really is. It's highly correlated with science. And we've got to find, as we're moving from the combustion fuel engine into different types of fuel, this is going to get a lot worse a lot quicker. And so I know we've got privacy issues out there in terms of what people don't want to see. I think we've already found out that everybody knows where everybody is anyways. I mean, right? And so somebody coming up with that model to move to a weight distance, maybe you start on the commercial trucks. It's already there, folks. We've got all that information, the new regulatory thing that just came out of Federal Highways that's doing all this electronic logging and everything else. They could very easily move to a weight distance. And then you follow with the passenger vehicles at a later time. If we would have adopted this 10 years ago, we'd be already halfway there today. But I just think it's so critical. As we move away from user pay, that's a big danger spot. And if we can't get to weight distance, everybody's going to be more and more frustrated. Because while it feels good right now to pass the FAST Act, that one felt good, and we taxed the Federal Reserve banks. We sold oil out of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve at $77 when the price was only $60, which was a big budget gimmick. At some point in time, that budget money won't be there even to find, and then highway funding is going to be in a crisis.
I'd like to weigh in on that. I've served on the original Transportation Research Board, TRB committee, that looked at the long-term viability of fuel taxes for highway funding. We recommended that it was clearly going to need to be replaced.
And what year was that, Bob?
That was the early 2000s.
Okay.
I think it partly led to the commission that you were on, and then the follow-up commission on the National Infrastructure Finance Commission that my colleague Adrian Moore served on. But I think one of the things we recommended as a step toward that was that state and federal policy should be promoting greater use of tolling as a per-mile user fee that would start the ball rolling toward number one, charging what it really costs to build, operate, and maintain infrastructure, which we're not doing with current fuel taxes. It's not sufficient, particularly for the high-end infrastructure like interstate highways. We are not generating enough. There's a cross-subsidy going on from people who drive on local streets paying gasoline taxes to the people who use interstates, which actually cost a huge amount more. The interstates, weight and distance, are wearing out. They're reaching the end of their useful lives. Over the next couple decades, almost all of them are going to need to be rebuilt, other than the small handful that have already been rebuilt. The money is not going to be there. If we have let's suppose we have a 25-cent increase in the federal gas tax, which I don't think is at all plausible or likely. But suppose we did. Would that money be dedicated to rebuilding the interstates? Come on, there's 108 programs in the highway and transit trust funds that are all supposed to be paid for out. Every single one of those has a constituency that will argue that they've got to get their piece of the 25 cents. We are not going to rebuild the interstate highways that way. One of the things that's gotten very little notice in the administration's proposal is to remove the long-standing federal ban dating to 1956 on using tolls on the interstate highways. That's simply giving permission. It's not mandating the state to do anything, but there's a half a dozen states ready to go to do that, Indiana being in the lead, with a plan over the next 20 years to rebuild and widen where needed all of their interstates, step by step by step, using toll financing to do it. So that the prototype is there, and I think it's going to be, I don't think it's going to be easy to get through Congress, but since it is only permission as opposed to regulating or requiring anything, I think it would be a very wise step to take, and it could be a big first step if states start doing this toward getting people away from paying per gallon and toward paying per mile.
Kevin?
Yeah. The Center for American Progress is very much supportive of doing mileage-based user fees.
We can agree on
We
something.
can agree on something. I think there are a few facts that we should throw out there as part of this conversation. One is, when we talk about tolling the interstates, we do have to be mindful that interstates, while not a pure monopoly, do have characteristics that mimic a traditional utility, right? And so traditional utilities, you have to go to a state public utility commission in order to ask for fee increases, and there has to be an economic justification for that. We do need to be leery that we don't want to see pricing on the interstates that looks like rent seeking, right? And to the extent that we want to do aggressive tolling, we feel very strongly that there is an equity question that has to be addressed, and that you need to have sort of parallel corridor investments in public transportation, and that you do need to have express bus service on the highway itself, and other things that make this economically accessible. Really what we have here is a reality, and that is we've built this massive highway system, and then we've put a lot of stuff on either side of it. So in the places where we have the greatest congestion, we have the least ability in order to engage in eminent domain and expand those facilities, right? So what we have is this question of a scarce resource that we're not allocating efficiently. And what the congestion pricing model that is most efficiently enforced with a mileage-based user fee allows you to essentially have a price mechanism that lets people make a choice about how valuable that particular trip they want to make is. If we look at the morning peak period, slightly more than half of people on the roadway are commuters, but that tells you that slightly less than half aren't. If we look in the afternoon peak period, according to the Federal Highway Administration, more than half of the people on the roadway in the afternoon peak period are not commuters. And many of those trips could be handled at other times of the day or on non-interstate highway and state highway roads. So what you have is even a light price signal can have people make their own decisions about whether or not that particular trip is worth the charge that's being levied. To this question of freight, because this comes up a lot, I think we have to understand that yes, we have some freight challenges, but I think they're often a little overblown in this regard. In the next 40 to 50 years, depending on which table you pull from the U.S. Census Bureau, the United States is going to add another 80 million people. We're going to hit 400 million, right? Roughly by midpoint of the century, maybe a little later. If current vehicle trends hold, we would add roughly 80 million light-duty vehicles. It's almost one-to-one, because there are some households that have more cars than they have adult drivers, right? But it's roughly one-to-one. If trends hold over that same 40 to 50-year period, we would only add about 750,000 long-haul trucks, right? So think about that. 80 million cars and only 750,000 long-haul trucks. We already have enough pavement laid down today to handle all of the current freight demand and all the future freight demand. What we don't have is enough pavement laid down for 80 million more passenger cars, particularly in dense metropolitan areas. So the issue is allocating that limited resource and then providing people options who either can't afford or don't want to pay so that they don't have to drive. That's really what you have to marry those two things together.
Kevin, I just want to say, I think there's a disagreement in numbers. The FHWA has something called the Freight Analysis Framework that does very detailed quarter-by-quarter studies of future freight demand, rail and truck, and shipping. And we massaged a bunch of their data on individual interstate highway corridors about 5-6 years ago. And projecting through 2040, there are several dozen corridors, some of them in one state. These are long-distance interstates, not urban ones.
Right.
And so a number of them multi-state, 2 or 3 states, where the a fraction of vehicle miles traveled is more than 40%, in some cases 60, 70%
Right.
of the total.
Right.
And so
Right.
we identified those as good candidates for dedicated truck lanes. And
Right.
I think there's a need for
Yeah.
some of that in the overall planning.
Yeah, I think the issue there is that it's those trucks are disproportionately on the interstate system,
no,
right?
exactly,
So
yeah.
it's a relatively small volume of vehicles.
Overall trucks, yes,
Exactly.
okay.
Yeah,
All right.
absolutely.
So just before John goes, Bob is very modest, but one chapter of his book deals with the interstate highway system as a public utility.
Yes,
Right?
yes.
And I can't recall the chapter, but it's, Kevin, your question is well taken.
Yeah,
It's
and it does talk about to what extent are there monopolies, what does economic evidence show, and it varies by roadway. You really have to look at it case by case.
Yep.
But in general, we've had only one experience with subjecting a toll road to utility commission regulation here in Virginia, the Dulles Greenway. It turned out to be politically very dicey, and what most countries have done and what all the other P3 toll projects have done is build in the regulatory control into the long-term concession agreement so that the state DOT becomes the regulator, but it isn't the same kind of political circus as utility commission rate hearings are.
Right. I'm sorry. I don't mean to suggest that public utility commission is the model we want to follow for pricing.
Okay.
Just
But-
that there's a reason why they
Yeah,
exist.
yeah.
Absolutely,
We agree.
and that's very much acknowledged. He's
Yeah,
read
John,
the chapter.
you can have the last word, then we're going to go to the audience.
Sure. I just want to recognize that I think, the motor fuel tax on vehicles started out as a very crude proxy for use,
Yes,
right?
it was.
So 100 years ago, states started doing that. Oregon actually was
started.
the first
It was
one.
Oregon, yeah.
1919.
The federal government used that as the underpinning of the trust fund in the 1950s in lieu of tolling, right? But
right.
what we have now is a proxy user fee model that is so broken that any kind of price signaling that it sends is completely opaque, right? So we've done, man on the street interviews asking, hey, how much do you think you pay in federal and state gas taxes? Take a guess. People said anywhere from $2,000 to one guy says $7,000
Per
a year.
Per year.
Right.
Yeah, it's so non-transparent.
Right.
I mean, it's people
That's
have
the
no
problem.
idea. They know what they pay for electric, water, gas, all these utilities. Your cell phone and your cable and all that sort of stuff, but they have not a clue what they pay.
That's
for
exactly
highways.
right.
Yeah.
So it comes out to about $290 a year for, again, both federal and state gas taxes. But when you go to the pump, it's collected at much higher up in the chain, right? So you get the receipt. It doesn't show any breakdown of how much it is at taxes versus the fuel versus the transporting of the fuel, profit margins. There's no breakdown whatsoever. So while it's created a very efficient collection structure where we talk about 99 cents of each dollar in fuel taxes going actually to infrastructure development purposes, people have no idea what they're paying.
Right.
And then on the flip side, in a market-based economy, you drive over a bridge, people have no idea, and frankly, do they care, right? This is out of 20% of National Highway Performance Program dollars, 40% local match. It's fundamentally broken, and we recognize at the state DOT level that we need to do a better job of whatever the mechanism is. And the fuel tax model, yes, lots of problems, but we just have to tell people better what we're asking them to contribute that's in line with what their use of the system is. So some states are now even having little stickers at the pump just to say, hey, X cents per gallon is going to the state tax because it's not
When
going to
I was
show
a
up in your
kid, that was
receipt.
standard on gas pumps, and it disappeared somehow, and it's now just starting to make a comeback in a few states. I'm glad
Exactly.
to see that. Washington State, I think, is one of the ones that's starting it up.
Absolutely. And then Missouri, I'll put a plug for those guys because they have a Citizen's Guide to Transportation, like an interactive website. Just plug in, how many miles do you think you typically drive, and then it'll tell you exactly how much in terms of fuel taxes they pay, and then how it supports to invest in their, state's transportation system. So, that's not everyone's going to go crash down the MoDOT website to use this tool,
Right.
but it's a step, and we're trying to do a better job.
Okay, great. We have about 15 minutes or so for questions. Yes, sir, right here. Then,
Thanks, Rick Rybeck with Just Economics, and really appreciate everything that's been said so far. I want to talk about funding and about the fact that how we get the funding might be just as important as how much funding we get. So just, again, talking about like what people mentioned already with user fees, a lot of us pay for water and sewer with a per gallon fee. And when we have a leaky faucet, we don't just see water going down the drain, we see our money going down the drain. And we want to fix that faucet. We could pay for water and sewer with a sales tax, but would people be motivated to fix their leaky faucets? Would they go out and buy something they didn't want just to compensate the water authority for the water they were wasting? Probably not. So there's a real value in the user fees, and most people on the panel seem to recognize that. But what we sometimes overlook is the person who owns the vacant lot. They're probably not drinking anything at that lot, not flushing any toilets. But the value of their land, you know, if there's water and sewer, imagine two separate vacant lots, equidistant from the center of town, with the same zoning, same characteristics, the same demand for either housing or business. One lot has water and sewer pipes right at the property boundary. The other doesn't have water and sewer pipes within a half mile. Which lot is more valuable?
Sure.
I mean, everybody's nodding, everybody knows. Well, the lot with water and sewer pipes at the property boundary is more valuable. Did the owner do anything to create that value? No. Where does that value come from? It comes from the Water and Sewer Authority. So in addition to user fees, we need to think about access fees, and we overlook that all the time. There was a question earlier about Metro. Metro cost about $10 billion to build. It has created more than $10 billion in land value around the stations. But Metro has no access. That value that Metro created, the lion's share of it is a windfall to people who are lucky or shrewd enough to own land around the stations. And the ability of private landowners to appropriate this publicly created land value is the fuel for land speculation. And land speculation produces nothing of value. It's purely a parasitic activity. So what do the panelists suggest about land value capture?
Mine's reaction is value capture. What you say is
specifically land value capture. Certain things that
and China's
parade as value capture really aren't, such as tax increment financing is really revenue segregation. It's not really land value capture.
But you make a very good point that I think resonates with the panelists. I don't know if anybody wants to. Value capture is the concept that pops into my head. Anybody want to react?
Two of the most robustly funded urban transit systems in the world are in the major cities in Japan and Hong Kong Mass Transit Railway, and that they're based on that because from the start, the properties where the stations are located were owned by the transit provider and are huge commercial, residential, et cetera. And so that makes the overall enterprise self-supporting. And it's unthinkable. The problem is, how do you go back when you've done, you know, private people have already acquired that land value now. It's a very difficult thing politically to think about going in and saying, well, that you shouldn't have got that. That should belong to Metro. Well, in apocalyptic, eventually, I suppose, yes.
That's a good point. Right. Sir, you've been waiting very patiently. Can we get him the mic? Here she comes.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. What can be done to utilize the internet to get together the people who want to fund things and to get an economic consensus of what's going to be done and how much it'll cost?
Sounds like lowering transaction costs argument. I think of Ronald Coase and that whole line of research that has won several Nobel Prizes in economics. But I don't have a good... It's a profound point in some... Dan, did you want to answer that? I don't...
Actually, I wanted to offer a thought about finance.
Okay. So I didn't want to just drop his question. But, sir, your question is about transaction costs, I think, of bringing buyers and sellers and investors and those in need of investment together using the internet. I've heard of, certain startups that are interested in trying to, take infrastructure investment, securitize it, break it up into smaller pieces so that smaller investors can invest in infrastructure. The big problem right now is, of course, it's lumpy. as we say in economics. It's a lumpy investment. You have to be a large institutional investor to do a lot of these. They're complicated things. My sense is this market could evolve in a way, that would lower transaction costs over time and allow smaller, less sophisticated investors to undertake, whether it's debt or equity, in a project, right? But we're not even close to that. I think it's going to take a long time.
But I think, Kevin, I would disagree with that slightly in that when you go out and buy a municipal bond or you invest in a mutual fund that goes out and buys municipal bonds, that's many thousands or tens of thousands or millions of small investors who are putting private capital into public projects, right? It's public debt, but it's private capital that purchases those securities. And then on the equity side, pensions are often some of the biggest players, and that again is many thousands of small investors that have been aggregated up into a pension fund. So there is less of a matching challenge actually with infrastructure than there are with a lot of other markets because these projects are big and it's a professionalized process, and there are definitely ways that you can go and solicit capital. So there are no shortage of people who would love to put money into a deal. It's for various economic reasons, there just aren't that many deals that match up.
I know in the case of Pennsylvania, they had a program of, I think, 500 bridges they were going to put into a CP, single P3. I think Missouri had something similar. There's ways to packaging it and lower the transaction costs. One thing about funding and finance, you can do funding without finance. You can't do finance without funding.
Right.
That's
Absolutely.
fundamental. The other point, the 900-pound gorilla in that room of funding transportation is the development community. Developers are a beneficiary, okay? Users are a beneficiary, but we don't charge the beneficiaries of the development community in terms of infrastructure. If you think about P3s being joint development, that's getting together ahead of time to bring in the money and securitize that development before the infrastructure is built. They did that in Orlando with the Sun Rail project, where they talked to the developers ahead of time before developing the stations. They're doing this now with the high-speed rail line in Florida, where much of the cost is going to be paid for by development over stations, air rights, and there's a lot of examples of that. But one last point, in terms of reducing the cost of the whole program through permit and streamlining, I work for Prince George's County, and 5 years ago we developed the Department of Permitting, Inspections, and Enforcement. We took 9 agencies, put them into one. We took a process that would take years and years and cut it down. We developed the MGM hotel casino facility out there from cradle to grave in terms of building it, designing it, developing it, and putting it and opening it. It took 24 months. That was a $1.6 billion facility that should have taken 48 months. It's doable.
This gentleman over here has had his hand up for quite a bit.
Hello, I'm Darren Nelson, economist. Has anybody on the panel thought about, you mentioned P3s many times, you even mentioned Australia. So have you thought about copying something like Australia's national competition policy, which is actually, the analogy would probably be like, instead of just giving people fish, it's actually teaching people how to fish. In other words, they spend $5 billion over 10 years, but the return to not only tax revenues, but economic growth through an infrastructure revolution was pretty huge.
So I'm not sure, I thought I heard you say competition policy, which means...
Yeah, national competition policy...
Antitrust in U.S. terms?
No, actually, so national competition policy was actually mainly infrastructure reform in Australia.
Yeah.
Introducing competition where you could, better managing monopolies in other situations.
Yeah, so I do have to make a plug so because it's through AEI, I have a policy brief on what are called PPP units, and this is an entity within government, right, of former lawyers, consultants, et cetera, bankers who have worked on P3s, who are now like a consulting entity to government within, whatever jurisdiction it is. The Australians have one for New South Wales, Victoria. They have a federal one. The Canadians are leaders in this. There's partnerships, British Columbia, right, and so on. And it's a policy brief on that with a former student who's now at Stanford named Carter Cassidy. So we're advocating that for the United States, but if we could get some states together to form a regional PPP unit, they could sort of share expertise and do P3s properly. So I think that might have gotten to your first point about education, but I'll just toss that out. Kevin wanted to respond.
A little more broadly than just to that question, because we've been moving down this path of talking about user fees and sort of matching use and benefit with paying for things and value capture. And I think all of those things are very good. But again, we should recognize that there are many places in which that model would break down. There are many places that are not, in a sense, self-sufficient from a tax and use perspective, right? There are many small rural communities for which PPPs or value capture are simply not an option, right? I'm from Toledo, Ohio originally. I can tell you that Toledo, Ohio has lost more than 100,000 people in the last 40 years. The finances of that region are incredibly precarious, yet they still have a lot of legacy facilities that need to be reconstructed and rebuilt. If economic self-sufficiency is the model that we're trying to push, we should recognize that there are a whole lot of places that are going to be dramatically left behind. So to the extent that we're pushing the burden down in our federal system of government onto local units, that is going to, in many instances, exacerbate regional differences. Let me give you an example. The administration has pointed to Measure M in Los Angeles County that passed in 2016 by 2/3 of the vote of Los Angeles County residents. That's a great political victory, and it's going to give that region a huge fire hose of cash to do a lot of necessary projects. LA County also has an annual GDP of more than $700 billion. That is not representative of most places in the nation, right? If I just think back again to Ohio, Akron, Cleveland, we go to Pennsylvania, Hershey, Pennsylvania, you can all sit here and think of 30 places for which value capture would generate $0, right? Because there simply isn't robust economic growth. And if you were on the verge of enticing a company to come there and then you said to them, by the way, we'd like to have some value-added taxes to this transaction, you might see that company turn around and leave and go someplace else. So again, it's not that there's anything wrong with matching up use and benefit with charges or value capture. It's just that there is a range of regions over which that is applicable and project types over which that's applicable, and many where it is simply not. Good point.
Sir, right here in the front, yeah. So he's going to bring a mic. Hang tough. Yeah.
My question is on efficiency and the use of funds. As you may have heard, that Arlington had a $550 million streetcar proposal some years ago that was canceled. And there are many others over the last 8 to 10 years that have been built. Charlotte, for example, just recently completed a 9-mile addition to a previous light rail line that cost about $1 billion. However, a much less costly proposal, which would involve a bus rapid transit, about 30% of the cost of the light rail was ignored. So the question is that when you look at the NEPA process, and I know the gentleman from AASHTO supports that, and I know the administration wants to reduce the amount of time that's involved, but it seems that in many of these projects, the whole reason for the NEPA process is to weed out inefficient projects. And I cite the example of light rail or bus rapid transit. So when you're using constrained funds, limited funds, you want to get the best productivity, the most people move per dollar of investment. And that's my concern, is how do you do that? How do you really reduce the time frame when cities frequently will propose a more expensive, the shiny new objects? They like that. Local politicians love to say that I got funds for this project. You can see a streetcar project or light rail, and it resonates more with the business community than does bus. So how do you deal with this project right down at the local level? Because we've heard the administration wants to put the burden, if that's the word, at least the incentives down at the local and the state level. But there's a conflict here. So how's that conflict resolved?
Bob, I'm not putting pressure on that.
I know one thing to say about that there used to be in the Federal Transit Administration's New Starts program some kind of a cost-effectiveness measure that you had to score a certain level or the project could not get funded. That seems to have largely gone by the boards in the last 6 or 7 years, and I'm not sure why, but it may have had the effect of allowing a lot of projects that are not really good value for the money to get funded by that program.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I would just say that FTA still has a cost-effectiveness measure. They changed how they did it a few years back, but it's still very much there, and that is how they score projects. I think your conception of NEPA is a little off. NEPA is not intended to do a cost-benefit analysis or to look for a low-cost alternative. NEPA is fundamentally about trying to discover, before you start construction, what negative harms to the natural environment and to the human-built environment and people and communities may result from that project, but cost is not one of the factors.
Well, wait a minute now. In the case of the Arlington streetcar project, I was involved in that from the very beginning. They did talk about alternatives such as a bus rapid.
Of course, NEPA requires you to look, to put forward a series of alternatives. Yeah, but
Costs were understated. So this is one of the reasons with the process over time is that the true costs come out as you get into more detail on the project.
We're a few minutes over, so I don't want to keep our, just maybe if you have a question for an individual panelist, they could answer afterwards. But let's thank our panel for. Thanks for doing it.